Hey guys, welcome back to the Glitch Kitchen. I'm your host, Sam, aka 5am, and today I'm really stoked to take you guys on some further neuro-based adventures, which is going to consist of just sharing some epiphanies I've had while simplifying and codifying my workflow over the past year with one of the hardest sounds to make in electronic music today, which is neuro-bass, which it's just awesome, and I've been trying to make it for like 5 years, and I think recently I've gotten the closest I've ever gotten. So I just wanted to share some of the concepts that I've run up against along the way. And I'm calling it Further Adventures because I really take it all the way through the process to where it's being used in a beat. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. So in this video, I'm going to be working with the Soundtoys Effect Rack, which I've been slowly incorporating into my workflow. Even if you don't have Soundtoys, I think you'll still get a lot from the video, so bear with me while I'm working with those effects and experiment on your end with things like chorus and saturation to achieve similar results to the plugins that I'll be looking at, which are, by the way, Decapitator, Primal Tap, Microshift, and CQ. So with all of that said, now I think it's time to dive into some bass sound design. So first I'm going to play you guys something like what we're going for, just to give an example. So here's the bass, the style of bass sound kind of stretched out to a full 2 bars. So it's this really gritty neuro-bass sound where the frequencies are kind of competing and pushing each other out of the way and just kind of folding over, like all the sounds kind of are folding over themselves. It's a really dynamic sound. So now here's that sound used in a beat in a sampler. So that's sort of like what we're shooting for. Now let's dive into the bass patch. So I'm going to load up Operator. Just a disclaimer, this is not exactly a beginner tutorial, so I'll be skipping over a lot of stuff. It's kind of more on the advanced end, and I cover a lot of ground quickly, so I'll definitely jump over some things. But I encourage you to bear with me because conceptual stuff also comes out along the way that I think can really shed some light on some new ideas or new ways of looking at bass design. So yeah, let's get into this. Just gonna play a low F. I think it's like a F0. And now I'm going to go into Oscillator A, and into the Oscillator tab. I'm just going to click on that little guy, and then I'm going to draw in my harmonics. So what's really cool about drawing in your harmonics is you can pick the ones you want and leave out the ones that might get muddy. And I had it on the wrong note, so now we're at an F0. Sorry about that. So I like boosting the 7th. It's like a minor 7th in terms of like what the relationship is to the root note. And then like the 9. It's like ba ba. Those are nice harmonics to boost. So now I'm going to turn on Oscillator B, make that 5 in the course, and fine tune it by 5 cents. So the fine tuning here is going to start to add some of the depth and movement to the sound. Just turn up Oscillator B just a bit. And then Oscillator C is back at 1 again in the chorus. I'm going to fine tune that by 5 as well, but by putting it down to 1 again, it almost like adds that original fundamental back into the timbre. It makes it really toothy. So I'm just experimenting with kind of like trying things out. I like to just like leave gaps in the spectrum, but have like strong peaks as well. That can be fun. Just creates these really unique timbres. Anyways, it's a pretty good starting point. So now I'm gonna select the top bar of it and grouplicate the device. Grouplicating, that's a word that I made up. It means group and then duplicate. So I'm gonna hit this little list icon there and select the chain, duplicate, Command D. You can also right click, duplicate. And then I'm going to high pass this layer. So I set that filter to high pass, turn it on, set to high pass, move that to like the middle. Like I guess I'm gonna go with like 500 hertz, and then I'm basically just splitting my bands at this point, so I can design the high end and the low end right from the start. So then I'm gonna make this cutoff 500 as well. So now we have a low pass at 500 on one of the layers, and a high pass at 500 on the other. To the high layer, I'm gonna add chorus. And now you'll hear the new bass sound. So it's a little more toothy, and you can actually design the teeth now. So as you turn up the oscillator B, the entire waveform starts to get more complex, and it really just comes down to how complex you want to make it. So we'll start there, and then that's going to be a good starting waveform. Then we're going to add a frequency shifter, and it's being used in a very specific way. I'm going to turn the rate down to a slow rate, like in this range here. And then turn the LFO up a little bit, like to 1.3 hertz or something in that range. And that's basically going to make the fine tuning go like from up to down like that. That's what that's going to do. So let's listen to the effect of that. The rate of it is changing, which is a nice effect. It kind of pulsates in a nice way. So yeah, I'm going to leave that where it's at. Maybe turn the dry width down just a little bit. So that's like a filter. After that layer, we're going to add distortion, or in this case, saturation, but it's being used to distort. So you'll see a pattern that after a layer of filtration, I like to do a layer of distortion. It's just a way of sort of like pulling out harmonics with distortion and then taking them out again using filtration, or boosting something into a distortion at a particular frequency, because the one thing we'll touch on is that as louder frequencies hit a distortion, those are going to be the frequencies that distort more. You might say it amplifies the sound. I mean, that would be like, that's what it does. So yeah, but it does it in like a exponential way, where like the sounds that are louder going into the distortion seem to be boosted more in their resonance than the quieter sounds, and that's something that we can take advantage of. Oh yeah. So yeah, let's record in a MIDI clip, or in this case, you can record it in, or you can just create it. Command-Shift-M to like create a clip. But I'm just going to copy one down from that I already had. But it's at F0. There's a little clip at F0. Let's hear what that sounds like. So that's already a little loud to my ears. I'm just going to make it quieter by adjusting these chains. And I'm going to name them just to stay organized. Sorry to jump around a little bit. I tend to do that. And now, now that we've added a layer of distortion with the saturator, I'm not going to discuss this too much. It's maybe a conversation for another day. But so saturator is no pushover when it comes to getting a really heavy distorted bass. But today we're going to look at some other techniques as well. So now I'm going to add a Morph LFO rack. It's a rack that I made, and it's very inspired by a Keota tutorial that I watched. And I'll link to Keota's channel down in the description, because this is heavily inspired by his stuff, and I'm definitely super grateful to be able to watch those videos, because it really helped me make some breakthroughs. So what's going on here is that I have two parallel chains. Each one has an auto filter set to Morph, but we're going to be changing the rates of the different auto filters, and that's going to cause some really nice dynamic movement in the bass. So I'll just play what that sounds like right off the bat. So the LFOs are on the morph positions. The filter is going to be morphing between low pass, high pass, band pass, and notch. And as it does that, it's going to be boosting certain frequency, certain parts of the spectrum, and then cutting certain parts of the spectrum very quickly. And depending on where frequencies compound or mask each other going into the next phase of processing, that's going to have a huge impact on the sound. And you're going to hear how, as the sound as the spectrum folds, the result of that kind of heavy filtration and an added filter movement. I'm just going to automate the rate of each filter just a bit. These other knobs are controlling the rate of the LFO, controlling the filter frequency. So changing that is going to have an impact on the sound as well. All right, I'm going to do some automation on this other one. So I like to keep the rates kind of down in this range that I have them now. If you go up too high, it just starts to get crazy. So like if I go really high with the rate on the Morph filter, it sounds cool sometimes, but it gets extreme. So that's going to make for some great distortion later on. So yeah, I think I'm happy with how these are all automated now, and I'm going to move on to the next stage of processing, which I'm going to do with the Soundtoys Effect Rack. So I just took the effect rack and I grouped it into a preset, so I could name it as a preset in my places sidebar. It makes it easier to just pull it up when I need it. So yeah. So this is the Soundtoys Effect Rack, and basically what's so cool about an effect rack is that because all these different tools are visible in one view, you don't have to constantly go opening and closing VSTs to edit your bass. You can actually just go into this effect rack and just scroll up and down through all these different effects. So what we have loaded up in this preset are Soundtoys Decapitator, which is a distortion plugin, Primal Tap, which is a delay, Microshift, which is a stereo plugin, and then CQ, which is just like a really basic EQ, but I'm also using it for drive and to boost the high end. It just gives a really nice bright high end boost. So let's start by just playing the before and after. So here's the bass without the effect rack. And then when I add the effect rack in, it's going to make it significantly louder. So I'm just going to turn the output down first. So that definitely distorts the bass a lot. In this case, it might be a little much, but luckily we can dial some things back if need be. I'm just dialing back some of the distortion on it. So these different boxes down here are different amp settings for Decapitator. They're based on old school rack gear that was used in a lot of, sort of favored by mixing and mastering studios. Basically, all the Soundtoys plugins are sort of loyal but creative recreations of old school gear. So the previous preset N was, I believe, based on a Neve preamp, and E is based on an EMI console that they had at Abbey Road Studios. So it's pretty cool. It's not the Beatles, but it's pretty cool. I mean, I'm not the Beatles, but yeah. So what the punish button does, which is on, is it actually boosts the gain of the incoming signal by 20 dB. So it gives it a lot more distortion, and it's really nice. So if I turn that off, it's a little bit more of a gentler distortion. So just having that on is responsible for a lot of the grit in this bass right now, where the drive is up to 4 and the punish is off. there are some sweet spots where you can get it to sound super clean but dirty, you know? I'm going to stick with the punish on and the drive all the way down. That's giving it 20 dB of gain into distortion, but not turning the drive up much. Okay, so moving on to Primal Tap. This plugin is a delay, and it's being used right now a little bit more like a comb filter. So I have a little bit of an LFO going on here with the rate and the depth, and that's going to change the delay amount. So like over towards like 5 to 10 is going to be like short delay, like low resonance added to the bass. So here's what that sounds like when I mix it in. So you hear that combing effect. So it's kind of up to you where you want that to sit, or if it's even appealing. But I do think it adds some nice wetness to the sound. Okay, so moving on to micro shift. This is just being used in this case to add a little bit of detune and delay to the sound in stereo. So like stereo detune, where the sound is slightly higher pitch or differs in pitch between the two channels, left and right. These other styles are different models of stereo gear that are being emulated. But what I find is that the delay and detune are a little more extreme, which actually makes for some nice sort of background noise layers in the bass. So with the first preset, and then with the second one, and a longer delay, it's a little bit more of a spatial kind of noise layer, which is really nice in this case. And then finally, CQ is being used here just to make the sound a little bigger. Sometimes when you cut out the mids a little and then boost the highs and the lows, you can make a sound feel like it's more present and like it's more dramatic. And I like my bass with very crispy high end. So finally, I'm actually going to load up Glue Compressor. I'm going to add that to the end of this chain, and that's going to give us our final layer of clipping, which is going to add a nice amount of presence and bring the bass right up in front of your face. So since it's not as clean as it could be, I'm going to just see what I can do to attenuate some maybe problematic frequencies using an EQ. So a lot of the time around 1,000 hertz is where you're going to get a little bit of like harsh frequency in bass. And then around 10 kilohertz is where you're going to get some nice kind of airy frequency in bass, just generally speaking, in my experience. So if you're wondering what's creating that pulsating feeling between the sub and the high end, what I seem to find is that as you distort a sound, as you distort a bass sound especially, when the sub gets louder, frequencies in the high end will tend to duck out a little bit. So it's almost like they're wrestling for command of the spectrum. It's like the high frequencies are louder than the bass. They're going to get distorted, and you're going to get the high frequency blare. And then when the bass gets louder, when the sub or the mids get louder, they're going to give you that strong resonance that's being created by being boosted by the amp. So it's almost like whatever's loudest going into the distortion is going to have the biggest impact on the resulting sound. So Now I'm actually going to demonstrate a quick band splitting technique that'll kind of show what I'm talking about there. So right now the sub is running through the effect rack, but we're going to create a new chain that doesn't have an effect rack. And we're just going to split the frequencies. So I'm going to put an EQ3 on the sub. It's going to become the sub. So I'm going to mute the mids and highs and set the cutoff at 120. And then I'm going to just alt-click and drag that. And that's going to go after the effects. I'm going to turn on the mids and highs here on this EQ so that any additional low end that might be created by the effect rack gets cut out by the filter. If you put the filter before the effect rack, then you might get some additional low end that's added by effects within the processing chain. So we don't want that. So, all right, now play the result of the band splitting. It might sound a little bit different. I'm not sure really if EQ3 is the most transparent way to do band splitting, but so it might have colored the sound a bit, but here's the result. Yeah, so right off the bat, the sub is too quiet. And you can hear that because the highs are really jumping out. So I'm just going to boost the sub with some saturation. And I'm going to turn both chains down a little bit. So it really transforms the sound to turn the high end down by 6 dB. So I'm actually just going to turn it down to -4 dB. I'm going to maybe turn it down within the EQ itself, so I'm turning them down in a balanced way. And now that our bass is pretty much built, we can start to tweak things, like we can come back to our initial starting waveform and adjust things over here. So I'm just going to tweak this a little bit. And just getting a little annoyed by the presence of that comb filter. So I'm going to adjust that and maybe turn it down a bit. Yeah, that's going to be the winner, I think. So I just tweaked some of the filter automations and settings here to just get some smoother movement, but hadn't really changed too much. I'm actually just going to dial back the mix of the effect rack just a bit because I think it was starting to blow out the sound a little bit too much. So now I just dialed back the mix of the whole effect rack. So that's another cool benefit of using an effect rack. So I'm just looking for harmonics that might be nice to boost to get a more kind of chunky timbre out of it. And I really like that one harmonic right there. But I also want to hear more from the high end. Yeah, so I could play around with that for days, but I think I got this to a place that I like it. So now I'm gonna freeze the track. I'm also going to drink a little bit of water. Guys, please remember to drink water while you're producing. That's like the number one tip that I give anybody is drink water. Alright, so I've got this frozen MIDI clip. I'm going to alt-click and drag it onto an audio track with its buddy over here. See if we got something comparably cool. Yes, indeed. All right, so to bring this into a beat, I'm just going to move that old clip. What most people would do to bring this into a beat is they might, or what a lot of people would do, I don't actually know what most people do, but they might just arrange clips of this bass on the grid, like so, in an audio track. And maybe they would just like change the position within the file or whatever. But like, you could also go onto a MIDI track, create a sampler, and you might just have the sampler play the bass back and actually write in the bass line with MIDI. So that's a bass that I've made previously. But now we're just going to click and drag this new bass into that same place. And I'll demonstrate some of the inner workings of this setup. So I've just made it a loop, and now I'm going to just set the root note to F3. That should put my new bass into this existing sampler loop. Okay, so that's pretty neat. I'm going to just deactivate these chords because they kind of mess with the vibe a little bit. So what's going on here is that the sampler is set to read velocity input as sample offset input. So the velocity input has a destination A set to sample offset, and then I've set it to the amount to 100, which means that whatever the velocity is, it's going to change the sample playback position. So I actually have the volume to velocity set to 0%, which means that incoming velocity info doesn't actually change the volume. So now I have this kind of janky setup here with two velocity devices where essentially what I'm trying to achieve is being able to go from 0, from like the beginning of the file, all the way to the end. And right now, like if you just have one velocity effect and one knob, like for the drive or whatever, it goes at like a limited range. So what I found is if you have two velocity effects, you can at least like use them both to get to wherever you want to go in the file. It's kind of hard to explain, but I'll just kind of mess around with this and I'll show you guys what we can do. Another thing that's at play is I have a big old pitch envelope going, 410 milliseconds from 24 down to 0. So it's like a 2-octave pitch envelope, and just listen for that and what that's doing. It's like boom, 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 boom. So if I make that longer, it's going to change the sound entirely. And that's just going down from 24 to 0 a little bit slower. You can also make it 0 and just hear the playback of the sample. Let's start there, because what's interesting and what I want to get into is moving this drive knob to change the playback position. It only really matters where the automation is when the MIDI note is played. So it doesn't really matter how it moves between each like new note in message. So you can like automate it however you want. Or what matters is where the automation is at when the new note is played. Woo. So it's just playing the sample back from different points. Let's add some pitch oscillation back into that. Or let's add some pitch envelope back into that. And now let's switch up the bass line entirely to where it's more of like a moving melodic bass line. But now let's turn the decay down so it's a little bit more of a, or the pitch envelope down, it's a little bit more of a normal hit. Let's elongate those a little bit. Anyways, I think I've sort of demonstrated the potential of this workflow and this process. There's so much more that I could talk about, touch on, try out. But yeah, anyways, guys, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of The Glitch Kitchen. And I really appreciate those of you who let me know how much the tutorials help you. It keeps me motivated to make more of them. And I really intend to, going into 2019, I want to make more tutorial videos because I have so much knowledge that I want to share with people. So thank you guys once again for joining me on the further adventures of Neuro Bass. Best of luck in your musical journeys and keep it glitchy.